So characteristics, continuing on, the first were the sort of influences. Now let's take a look at some of the characteristics of the traditional Japanese architecture. All right, so some of the key things that I want you guys to be aware of is that almost all of the structures are made out of wood and bamboo. There's very little in the way of this idea of a masonry structure. Okay, now, if you recall, we talked about early cultures building in wood, and that's why there really wasn't always a whole lot of sort of stuff left to talk about their culture, right? Remember that discussion?
Yeah.
And it was in relation to Mesopotamia, and then they also built with mud brick, which unfired mud brick would just deteriorate once it got wet again. And so a lot of the structures and stuff that we might find in literature weren't available, but the stone structures were still there. Okay, so Japan, you got to understand that there is a lot of focus on purely wood and very little on masonry. And so there is not a lot of it left, but there is some of it left. Okay, so that's one of the characteristics. It's made out of wood. Okay. Second characteristic, because they worked with wood, and wood basically grows to certain lengths, right? And it's not like you could just, grow a bigger piece of lumber. Forests and stuff grow to certain lengths, and you can get certain sizes out of it. So they work with a system of proportional design. They used modular elements, okay? And modular elements were repeated exact modular elements, all right? The basic structure is a post and lintel or a trabeated construction. That means post, beam going across the top of it, okay? The spans are greater here than they were in Greece because they're using wood. Wood has stronger tensile properties than stone, and so they could get further spans with it. Okay? A lot of this idea of post and lintel also went to the fact that what sits between the two posts, the lintel and the ground, is an infill wall, right, that is non-load bearing. All right? Typically, Japanese architecture and Asian Chinese architecture have very large roofs with broad overhangs. Okay, so that's another characteristic that you'll see. The interiors are typically lit with soft, diffuse light coming in from the sides of the building. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about shoji screens and what they're made out of. One of the things about having this sort of open plan with posts and stuff, that instead of having all these bearing walls that you couldn't do anything with, is that the interiors were kind of flexible. You could move panels around and make a room bigger, or close up the panels and subdivide and make it smaller. Those are all things that later in modern architecture would be essentially discovered. Okay, so another thing that again we sort of discovered in modern architecture was this fluidity between indoors and outdoors. This idea that the walls would dematerialize to the outside and that there could be this linkage to the outside. And finally, one of the key aspects of especially Japanese architecture is this integration into a landscape. So the natural environment around the building and the building had this harmonious sort of relationship. Okay, very important things to sort of note. So let's take a look at some of these traditional characteristics. So typically, a lot of the Japanese architecture is going to have, instead of like digging a hole and putting a footing inside of the hole, they're going to mound up the soil, okay, and compact it. They're going to take the soil and literally ram it together to compact this base, like a podium, a plinth, right? But it's made out of dirt. Then there's going to be a series of wood columns or posts, and you can't just stick the posts in the dirt because you know that wood is porous, right? And so it's going to act like a straw. It's whatever moisture gets in the ground, it's going to suck it up. Plus, as it rots, it can start to sort of push down into the soil. So what they would do is they would put a stone at the bottom, a flat rock, and the post would sit on the flat rock. Okay? The walls in between those posts, we've already mentioned, were infill, non-structural. They did not support things above them. They just filled a hole. They had these very sort of elaborate roof structures. Okay, and we'll take a look a little bit of what makes those things up, but they're very big roofs. And the typical materials for finishing the roofs were essentially fired tiles or thatch. Okay, so when we look at this, we'll see these features there. So here are the posts, right, and the rocks. Here's the raised sort of plinth area over in here. There's that large roof structure with all of the wood beams kind of piled up on top of it. If we look over in here, you see the raised stone, or not raised stone, the raised soil base down at the bottom here. You see the posts coming down. You see the posts coming through the structure. You see the infill panels in between the posts, and you see that large sort of tiled roof on top of it. Okay, a little bit closer view of that. This is the Villa Katsura. So once again, you see a thatched roof up on the top. You see the post with the non-structural infill panel. You see the post coming down to the stone base. And again, down here, you see the compacted soil that was raised up rather than digging it down into the ground. Okay? So when we look at the wood sort of spanning systems and beams, we see that the Japanese and the Chinese developed a system of putting a beam up, right, and then putting sort of smaller beams in between it to take the span of the rafters. And that creates that very sort of ornate, sort of stacked character that you see. So we have the large beam running across the top, a secondary beam with a series of these pieces, these brackets that hold it in place, and then further support at the top. Here in this lower one, you see one where, again, we've got this sort of stacking of beams going all the way to the top. This portion is very much like that, and it's got these side pieces that are attached to it, again, with these sort of stacked beams. And the goal of the stacked beams is to try to essentially hit that diagonal roof, okay, at even intervals across the roof. That make sense? All right. So one of the other things that we take a look at is the non-bearing interior and exterior partitions. All right. So this is a typical Japanese house, and you can see you can see the posts coming down in a variety of different areas. There's one right in here. You see the beam up at the top. There's probably one just outside of the picture frame. And then you see all these panels. These particular panels happen to be shoji partitions. Shoji partitions are made from wood, and I believe it's oiled paper. So it's a thick paper that's oiled, and when they oil it, it picks up a resiliency that it doesn't have. Otherwise, it also sheds water to some extent. They allow like a translucent light to come in, and they're light enough to where they can be moved. There's a second type of partition called the fusuma, or a fasuma, and those are movable panels that are opaque, okay? So they allow the building to be opened to the outside. Here's an example of those fasuma panels, right? These are sort of ornate and decorated, but they're all movable panels. One of the other characteristics that we talked about is this linkage of the inside of the building out into the landscape. I mean, compare this to your house. Most of you guys have houses, most of you have windows in your houses that are like that. They're kind of a hole in a wall. You might have a sliding glass door, but it's generally not going to be a big sliding glass door. Maybe you might have one that's 6 feet. You might have one that's 8 feet if it's really big. All right. Typically, you know, our houses don't have that level of integration to the landscape. If you look at this, you see this framing of a view. right? The framing of a fountain, a pond, the trees, and it's almost like that's a picture frame that you're looking at. But it's almost like you're also living in the picture frame. All right, down below you see another one with a little path and the trees and the garden sort of going out. On the floor of these, you notice that there's a series of panels. Let me back up to the previous. Back up. There's no, that's not it. That's it. So there's one of the previous views. You see those mats down on the floor. Here's another one of the previous images. You see again the mats on the floor. Those are called tatami mats, okay? And the tatami mats are approximately 3 foot by 6 foot. So that's part of what created this modularity is the tatami mats had a standardized size. So, like, how big is your bedrooms at home? Let's see. Anybody? Bedroom. About how big is your bedroom? 12 by 10. Huh?
16 by 10.
Huh?
16 by 10.
16 by 10? Anybody else?
20 by 20.
Yeah. You live in a garage?
That's a garage.
That's in a garage. I knew it. 20 by 20. I live in a garage.
I did.
Okay. Any rate, so
My bedroom.
when we think about how big a bedroom is, we're going to say, well, it's this many feet by this many feet. In Japan, if you were working in a traditional sense, you would be building a room that could be a 12-mat room or a 9-mat room. The mats occupy a certain amount of area, right? And there are these configurations that yield, and these are in millimeters, unfortunately, we should convert them to feet, but they yield different proportions and they yield different sizes of spaces. Okay, does that make sense? So up in the top, this little one up here, this is like a 6 by 6 space, maybe a bathroom would be the about size of that. Here's one that is about 9 foot by 6 foot, 6 foot by 12 feet. So you see these kind of patterns emerging from the modularity of the tatami mat. Okay.
So these would just sit on top of the wood?
They are. They were made. They had a core of sort of rice fiber, and then on the outside there was a reed sort of outer shell. Was there a question?
Yeah, what about the middle ones in the middle?
Hold on. Sorry.
That's a little small.
Where are you looking? Bottom.
In the middle.
Here?
There you go. Another one.
Here?
Middle.
That's a half tatami. That's 3 by 3. So that you see this the half tatami occur again right here. See the one that's a bedroom pattern?
Yeah.
So this is 1, 2, 3, 4 and a half. So if you again think about it as in feet, right? It's 6 plus 3, right? Is 9 foot, and then going this way is 3 plus 6, 9 foot. They're little tiny bedrooms, but sounds a lot like the house I bought in La Quinta. Little tiny bedrooms. All right, so I think I better stop right here because I don't want to go over on the video, so hit escape.
La Quinta.